Swabian relatives, variation in the use of the wo-relativiser. So some linguists have theorized that morphosyntactic variables are not as socially stratified as phonological ones, causing them to lie outside the range of the sociolinguistic monitor. Others suggest that morphosyntactic variables convey a different type of social meaning than phonological or lexical ones do, and thus change in different ways. So to investigate these claims, this paper explores a variable widespread in various Southern German varieties, the use of wo, or where, as a relativizer, which commonly occurs in the spoken language in place of the standard German relative pronouns der, die, das, dem, so forth. So to date, no sociolinguistic variation analysis, to my knowledge, has been conducted on the use of wo relatives. So this paper seeks to address two research questions. What are the internal and external factors influencing the use of wo as a relative marker in Swabian? And two, is the use of wo as a relative marker in Swabian stable or changing? So due to the lack of variation in sociolinguistic studies of German relatives, I draw on the extensive work carried out on English relative clauses as the theoretical background for the current study. While there are some expectations that German and English relatives will react in similar ways due to universal cognitive processes, the primary reason for considering the work on English relatives is methodological. Much earlier sociolinguistic research has suggested that relative pronoun usage is a covert variable, not readily available for social evaluation. However, researchers working within the variationist framework began to find that variation in relative pronouns was not only constrained by linguistic conditioning, but also correlated with various social factors such as genre, style, education, socioeconomic status. Most of the research on relativization in German has been dialectology or typology oriented and is focused on formal issues. Outside of Pittner, little research has been conducted on relative pronoun usage in spoken German, and none has been of a sociolinguistic nature. So this study investigates relative clause usage in Swabian, or Schwäbisch, a High German dialect belonging to the Alemannic family, which is spoken by just over 800,000 people, or 1% of the German population. Two communities have been selected for this research, the large international city of Stuttgart and its surrounding suburbs, and the mid-sized town of Schwäbisch Gmünd and its surrounding rural villages. Stuttgart is the heart of Swabia. It's a large urban area with over 1 million inhabitants and is home to many well-known global firms such as Daimler, Porsche, Bosch, Siemens. Schwäbisch Gmünd lies 100 kilometers to the east of Stuttgart. With 60,000 inhabitants, it's a typical mid-sized German town surrounded by small rural villages with 77% of the land dedicated to woodland and agriculture. Attitudes towards Swabian vary. It's either loved or loathed. It's highly stigmatized by some and adored by others, as these two quotations from native Swabians show. 24-year-old Fabian remarked, "In a certain way, one is a little proud to be Swabian. It's 99.5% funny and positive, and no one makes a connection to farmers or whatever. It's pretty cool. Because of that, I think Swabians are viewed relatively well in Germany. They're hardworking people." 58-year-old Helmut said, "Well, nowadays my children are actually ashamed of Swabian. Well, they associate Swabian with something they don't like. They reject this village solidarity." Clearly, remarks like these and many others indicate that the Swabian linguistic situation is highly diverse and intensely personal. So this research combines both a trend study and a panel study based on data collected from 40 speakers recorded back when I was a PhD student in 1982, stratified for education, gender, and age. After a 35-year hiatus and continuing this research, between 2016 and 2017, I collected data from over 100 additional Swabian speakers, 20 from 1982 who re-interviewed and comprised the panel study. I've also selected 40 other speakers from the 2017 recordings who can be considered social twins with the 20 panel speakers in terms of age, sex, education, and community to create a real-time trend study. The twin speakers are matched for age, sex, education, and locality, and they produce an 84% overall match with the panel speakers. The methods used in this study consist of semi-structured sociolinguistic interviews conducted by native Swabian speakers with me in attendance in the role of a friend of a friend. To increase compatibility across the years, the same survey instrument was used in both 1982 and in 2017, covering questions about the speaker's childhood, hobbies, neighborhood, attitudes toward the Swabian language, and so forth. The initial transcriptions were completed by native German speakers, linguistic students at the University of Tübingen, Following a well-documented set of transcription guidelines and using a standard orthography that I specifically adapted for Swabian, I personally reviewed every transcript at least 3 times to validate the transcription to ensure all tokens were appropriately tagged and to normalize any transcriber bias. The quantitative methods entail raw frequency analyses and the use of generalized linear mixed models with random effects. So for those of you who aren't familiar with German, first a short review of the relativization system is in order. In German, relatives occur post-nominally and are head external. According to Duden, there are 3 primary ways to introduce a relative clause. First, the inflected D pronouns, der, die, das, dem, des, and so on, which can refer to a nominal, pronominal, or an adverbial phrase. There are also inflected W pronouns, welche, welches, which are generally restricted to the written language or to highly stylized spoken varieties. There were only 4 tokens in the panel study and none in the trend study. So due to these low token counts, I've combined the D pronouns and the W pronouns. 3, there are the non-inflected complementizers, wo, als, wie, was, wer, which have both standard and non-standard usages in many Southern German varieties. Only wo is considered in this analysis since the other complementizers don't vary with the D relatives. In addition, there are other types of relatives such as free or headless relatives, relative adverbs, and correlative conjunctions like je, desto that have also been excluded since they don't vary with the D relatives. Thus, the linguistic variable investigated in this analysis is the variation between the standard D relative pronouns and the use of wo as a relative marker. And I'll give you an example of that coming first. First, though, is a typology of wo, which is provided by Pittner, 2004. What are the different usages? First, most commonly, wo can be used as an interrogative adverb, such as in wo waren wir dabei? Where were we in the process? Wo is also commonly used as a locative adverb, as in Schwaben bleiben gern da, wo sie geboren sind. Schwabs like to stay there where they are born. Less commonly, and also in the spoken language, wo can be used as a temporal adverb, as in wo ich noch jung war, when I was still young. In standard German, the conjunction als would be used. Finally, and also only in the spoken language, wo can be used as a relative pronoun, as in das beste Deutsch, wo es gibt. Standard German requires the nominative neuter pronoun das beste Deutsch, das es gibt in this case. Duden patently declares the use of wo to refer to a non-locative to be landschaftlich salopp, country slang, and not standard language. So here's an example of the variation between the standard inflected D relative pronouns and the non-standard uninflected wo relatives as demonstrated by Angela. Es gibt erfolgreiche Menschen, there are successful people, wo Karriere gemacht haben, who have made their careers, und jetzt ein Haufen Geld verdienen, now earn a ton of money. Es gibt auch andere, there are also others, die vielleicht gar nicht so viel Geld haben, who perhaps don't have so much money. This example is particularly illustrative because of Angela's sequential use of a non-standard and then a standard relativizer, referring to the same human referent, erfolgreiche Menschen, successful people. So the first challenge is deciding what to count as a relative. Although some linguists propose identifying relative clauses in terms of function, I've based my analysis on a strict syntactic definition. Thus, following De Vries, there are 2 defining properties. A subordinated clause, which is conveniently disambiguated in German with a finite verb in clause final position, and the subordinated clause is connected to the matrix clause by pivot constituent, the relative pronoun or particle. De Vries also offers a third essential property of relative clauses. The semantic and syntactic roles that the pivot constituent plays inside the relative clause are independent of its roles outside the relative. Thus, it follows that other relative-like structures, such as participial constructions, pronominalizations, reduced relatives, unmarked relative clauses, and appositive structures, and so forth, are not included in this analysis. So I start first with an overall distributional analysis of wo relatives across the 2 communities. First, the real-time results, then the parent-time results. While relativizer use has remained stable in Schwäbisch Gmünd across the 35-year time span of the panel speakers, roughly 50-50, the results show a sharp decline in the use of wo in Stuttgart across the lifespan of these speakers, from 47% to 33%. A similar pattern can be seen in the twin study, with the Schwäbisch Gmünd speakers showing greater stability in the use of wo across the generations, in contrast to the Stuttgart speakers who demonstrate a significant decline particularly between the middle and the youngest generations. I attribute this decline in non-standard wo usage to the pervasive dialect leveling that is occurring in Swabian, driven by increasing education, mobility, and immigration. My research on over 30 other linguistic variables in Swabian shows that this convergence to the standard language is being led by the younger, more highly educated speakers in the large urban center of Stuttgart. A major factor constraining variation in the use of wo relatives is grammatical case. In fact, a change has indeed occurred across the lifespan of the Schwäbisch Gmünd speakers. The use of wo in the nominative case has declined, while its use in the dative case has increased from 59 to 91%. Yet there's no concomitant significant change in usage in Stuttgart. As we saw on the last slide, in Stuttgart, the use of wo as a relativizer has dropped across all cases. The apparent time findings mirror the real-time findings. Schwäbisch Gmünd remains stable over the generations, while Stuttgart is declining in wo relative usage. What usage remains is mostly found in the dative case. Before delving a little bit further into the analysis, it's important to note that Swabian also has a resumptive relative, the doubly filled complementizer, der wo. For example, they are the lazy Weifspätzle, those that they put through the press. This variable is characteristic of Swabian von der Alp, from the countryside, and is highly stigmatized. Likely due to the stigmatization and into increasing levels of education, this variant is in stark decline across both communities, from 4 and 8% in 1982 to just 2% in 2017, with considerably reduced token counts. So since no sociolinguistic investigation has previously been conducted on wo relatives in Swabian, I decided to cast a wide net and investigate a plethora of previously attested constraints on relative markers. So due to the time constraints in this talk, I can't explain each one, rather I'll refer you to my written work if you are interested in how each was defined. Cutting quickly to the chase, the results of the multivariate analysis revealed these 13 predictors to be significant. And here is the summary results from the best fit linear mixed effects regression model for both studies. Note that positive estimates favor the use of wo relatives, while negative estimates favor d relatives. With concordance values of 0.9 for both samples and percents correctly predicted of 82 and 81%, these models can be considered quite good at explaining the variability in the use of wo versus d relatives in Swabian. Rather than walk through each correlation coefficient, this graph provides a visual overview of the significant constraints using the plot coefs function in R. Blue squares mark the correlation coefficients from the panel study, and red circles the twin study. The effects are sorted with positive estimates favoring wo relatives at the top and to the right, and negative effects favoring d relativizers toward the bottom and the left. For effects that are significant in one model but not the other, the non-significant effect is plotted at the 0 point. The most striking finding is in the change in the use of wo relatives in real time in Stuttgart without a concomitant significant change in apparent time. As Sankoff's work shows, lifespan change generally mirrors community change. Thus, this change in wo usage across the lifespan can likely be attributed to age grading, in which speakers change their linguistic choices at different stages in their lifetime as a result of external societal pressures, commonly the linguistic market, while the rest of the community remains stable. In 2017, 5 of the 7 panel speakers from Stuttgart were at the height of their careers. 2 were school teachers, 3 were business executives. And it's highly likely that the speakers would use fewer non-standard forms in their 50s than they did when they were still in school in their 20s. Another socially, culturally relevant difference between the panel and the twin study speakers' use of wo is the significance of speaker mobility for the panel speakers and higher education for the twin speakers. These two effects patently expose the profound cultural change that has occurred in Swabia over the last 35 years. Higher levels of mobility is a deterrent of wo relatives for the panel study speakers. Greater mobility promotes more contact with speakers of other linguistic varieties, presumably ones that do not use wo relatives. However, by 2017, mobility has become the way of life, and higher education has taken over as the paramount predictor of relativizer use. Labov maintains that education is the single best predictor for assessing the social valuation of a feature, and with higher levels of education correlating with features of higher prestige, specifically those taught in schools. So not surprisingly, the influence of prescriptivism in the educational system can reduce and even eradicate non-standard forms, as these data show, even within one generation. The two strongest factors favoring the use of wo relatives are antecedents representing either physical or abstract notions of place, or specific or abstract notions of time. As expected, based on the supposed etymological origin as a locative marker, wo is strongly favored by the panel speakers for both notions of place and time. However, the twin speakers favor wo only for notions of place and not for non-standard temporal constructions. These results appear to reflect the influence of prescriptivism, which reproaches the use of wo for time reference. The third strongest factor favoring the use of wo relatives is the dative case, which we have seen is a powerful predictor for both groups of speakers. These results suggest that a structural change may be occurring in the German case system toward uninflected relativization in dative constructions, a point I return to in the next slide. The fourth and fifth strongest predictors favoring the use of wo involve the interaction of animacy and definiteness, specifically the interaction between indefinite and inanimate antecedents, and between definiteness and case, in particular indefinite antecedents and the dative case. These interaction constraints are significant for the panel speakers, yet only inanimacy turns out to be significant for the twin study speakers, signaling that perhaps a simplification or generalization of the constraint system might be taking place in Swabian. Additional evidence for the change in the Swabian grammatical system can be seen in the next strongest constraint, antecedent category. These findings show that wo relatives are favored with pronominal antecedents by the panel speakers and by adverbial antecedents by the twin speakers. This provides support for the move away from the use of wo as a relative marker toward its more standard prescribed use as an adverbial construction. In sum, these results reveal that the use of wo relatives is changing. While there are many significant internal linguistic constraints favoring the use of wo, the social constraints of increasing mobility in higher education are restricting its use and driving greater use of the standard de-relativizers. And it's the youngest generation and the urban city of Stuttgart who are taking the lead in this transition to the standard language, with Schwäbisch Gmünd following not far behind. So now I turn to discuss several of these findings in a bit more detail. First, are we seeing the demise of the inflective dative? For wo relatives be favored in the dative case is not surprising, considering the fact that the dative, like the genitive, has a different case structure in German than the nominative and accusative paradigms. Could this distinctive, more complicated, less intuitive structure be driving the dative the way of the genitive, which has completely died out of modern spoken German? Could Swabian be moving toward a two-case system, as with many of the Low German dialects, at least for relative pronouns? A quick look at Google Books Ingram Viewer for the dative article and relative pronoun dame shows that the use of this word has been in decline since 1860, accelerating its decline since 1940. Whether all dative case markings in German are in decline is clearly beyond the scope of the current analysis. However, evidence from the current study shows that wo is preferred over dame and der for marking relative clauses in Swabian. So next, in unraveling the use of wo as a relative pronoun, it's important to consider evidence from its socio-historical context and etymological evolution. As we've seen, wo relatives are favored with both physical and abstract notions of place, which is not surprising considering the locative use of wo, meaning where. However, there is some controversy over this interpretation. Brander and Boyningen argue quite convincingly that despite its homophony with the locative adverb wo, the wo relativizer originates from Middle High German equative particle so, some, which was widely used as a complementizer in early New High German and in Southern Alemannic dialects. Their claim is supported by the semantics of wo and through a historical and comparative analysis based on 4 arguments. So relatives were widespread in the early New High German period in the same areas where we see the wo relatives today, specifically the Upper German dialect areas, Swabian and Bavarian and Swiss German. Wo relatives started appearing in the literature about the same time when the equative particle als changed to the W series and became wie. The use of the equative particle some to introduce a relative clause is also found in other Germanic dialects, specifically various Scandinavian varieties. And interpreting wo as an equative particle provides an explanation for its use in both restrictive and non-restrictive clauses, as well as for the resumptive or doubly filled complementizer. Brenner and Boyning's analysis questions the assumption that wo relatives originated from the locative adverb wo. And I'm hoping some of the historical linguists in the audience know something more about the history of wo and so and some and can maybe shed some light on this issue. So some final thoughts on the change in the relativizer use in Swabian. The German rural divide is ever present. Across the 35 years of the study, the Stuttgarter dialect has become more standardized, developing into a super-regional variety for southern Germany, while Schwäbisch Gmünd has retained more of its traditional features. Thus, the loss of wo-relatives at Stuttgart follows the broader leveling and standardization trend. The emerging ethnolect in Stuttgart promotes wo-relative usage. Our site, Stuttgart, is one of the cities with the largest number of foreigners in all of Germany. 45% of the population have at least one parent not from the region, twice as many as the rest of Germany overall. Certainly, Stuttgart today comprises an amalgam of standard German speakers, Swabian speakers, and speakers with an immigration background. Our research on the developing ethnolect of immigrants in Stuttgart shows an exceptionally high use of wo-relatives to the complete exclusion of standard D-relative pronouns with some speakers. The lack of gender, number, and case markings with wo-relatives make them an ideal candidate for coinization. And the results show that the use of wo for notions of place has diminished in 2017, has completely disappeared for notions of time. Thus, wo may be going through a process of semantic bleaching and decategorization, losing its traditional meaning of where, along with the semantic and syntactic characteristics of an adverbial pronoun, and taking on the full properties of a relative pronoun. According to Hopper and Traugott, grammaticalization of relative pronouns through spatio-temporal metaphoric extensions is not uncommon. Vibey and Paliuka claimed that the human language users have a natural propensity for making metaphorical extensions that lead to the increased use of certain items. So, and as expected, higher levels of education suppress speakers' use of non-standard variants. These findings point to the fact that education and intractable teacher prescriptivism can and do obstruct the natural trajectory of language change. So the outcome of this research shows that higher levels of education and a sense of community belonging can convey a different type of social meaning. The persona of a modern, mobile, and highly educated Swabian speaking das beste Deutsch, wo es gibt, the best German there is. Danke. Thank you.